Hi everyone, I'm Barry Skillington and welcome to the second episode now of Straight Talking Science, where we try and distill science down into chunk-sized pieces that, everybody can understand. So we're very lucky to be joined today by Professor Ted Dinan, Timothy Dinan. He goes by Ted. He's an Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry in University College Cork, here where we are. Most cited medic in Ireland, highly cited scientist, highly published, and with over 40 years of research in, I'll let him describe his own research, but in gut brain and psychiatry and drug in the drug world as well, excuse me. So Ted, thank you so much and welcome. Maybe you could do a quick intro for people just to embellish on what I just said, and please talk about yourself ad nauseum.
Certainly, Barry. After leaving med school in Cork, shortly after I went to New York, and that's really, I suppose, where I begun my kind of research career, working in physiology, and then came back to London, where I was for a few years before taking my first kind of clinical post at a senior level in Trinity College in Dublin. I was a consultant in St. James's Hospital, and for over 20 years, I was professor of psychiatry here in Cork. When I look back at my career, I think I've been in one intellectual cul-de-sac after another. But over the last 20 years, I've largely focused on the brain-gut microbiota axis. And I really do feel that there is a lot of mileage in that area and that it is very relevant in relation to mental health and in relation to gut health as well. So I've largely, I suppose, focused on that over the last 20 years and left research, in endocrine nature and immune nature behind me, as it were. And I'm just focused on the brain-gut microbiota axis.
Brilliant. Okay. So I suppose for transparency, I'm the Chief Commercial Officer with Atlantia Clinical Trials. We do clinical research in supplements and foods and sometimes drugs and some medical devices. And Ted is our medical director, and we work sometimes very closely with the trial design. So just so that's out there in terms of how it all fits together. So let me start with everyday mental health. And I'm sure you're going to talk about stress. We're all stressed and we all think we're stressed out all the time. But what is really going on in terms of our everyday mental health? Is it worse today than it used to be? Is it better? Do we know more?
The most common kind of mental disorders that present in primary care and general practice would be anxiety disorders and depression. Now, people talk about stress, but it's necessary to point out that stress in itself is not an illness. It's a risk factor for depression. It's a risk factor for anxiety disorders. It is not a condition in its own right. Of course, it's often said that we're far more stressed than we ever were. I don't really believe that at all. I mean, for heaven's sake, we've had famines in Ireland. We've had lots of problems in Ireland where people didn't know where the next meal was coming from. I don't believe that, today is more stressful than, let's say, it was during the famine or in the 19th century. Of course, there are challenges in life and it would be wrong to ignore those. So I think stress is a very big issue. And I think, how we handle stress will determine whether or not we develop mental disorders like anxiety or like depression. And some people handle stress very well and some people handle it very poorly. There's an old law in psychology called Yerkes-Dodson law, and it basically says that as stress goes up, our performance improves up to a certain level, but that beyond a certain pivot point, stress becomes overwhelming and the performance decreases. So if you're a student and you're trying to study for the Leaving Cert or for the university exam or whatever, a certain amount of stress is good. But if the stress becomes overwhelming or goes beyond this pivot point, what you essentially get is decreased performance in those circumstances.
Right. So in terms then, maybe we'll move towards gut brain and then the obvious connotation is food and mood. So, like, in terms of food and mood, what should the average person, what should they know about food? I mean, so deep in the science, but, when they go shopping in their local supermarket or whatever, what should they be looking for in terms of protecting their brain?
Well, I think there is now overwhelming evidence that people who eat a lot of highly processed foods, and you go into a supermarket, there are lots of highly processed and ultra processed foods, that when you look at those people, the higher the intake of ultra processed foods, the higher the rates of depression. So unquestionably, the capability or the ability to deal with stress is altered by diet. That's not too surprising. I mean, at the end of the day, the brain is the most metabolically active organ in the entire body. So we need appropriate food. The most widely studied diet internationally is the Mediterranean diet. And there is evidence that people who are on a Mediterranean diet are less likely to suffer from severe stress. And in fact, not just that, there's a very good study by Felice Jacka in Australia, in Deakin University, where she took a whole lot of people who were suffering from depression. And she put half of them randomly on a Mediterranean diet or a slightly modified version of the Mediterranean diet, and half of them received social support. And they were followed over a 12-week period. And there was a dramatic drop in depression scores over the 12 weeks in those who were on the Mediterranean diet, and a far less dramatic decrease in those who received social support. So it does demonstrate that really diet influences how we deal with stress, and unquestionably is an important factor in how we deal with depression.
And so people should be choosing, like, what? Whole foods, vegetables, fruits?
I think so. I mean, when you look at the Mediterranean region, I suppose the key components that we should all try to have in our diet would be fresh fruit and vegetables, fermented foods, fish, nuts. Red meat is not good. I mean, I don't believe that red meat is a good component to have in one's diet. I mean, I'm sure the farming community won't thank me for that, but it's just a fact that it is the pro-inflammatory food substance.
Okay.
When you look at, we live in an island, and I'm always surprised by the number of patients that I see who never eat fish. They say they don't like the smell of fish, they don't like the taste of fish, they have loads of reasons why they don't eat fish. But fish is an exceedingly important component, I think, of the Mediterranean diet. And given the fact that it is fairly readily available in Ireland, I think you should be eating far more fish. I was lecturing at the Royal Society of Medicine in London a few years ago, and a GP who was working in Hackney, an area in London that I know very well, I've kind of practiced there myself, she stood up and she said, look, it's all very well for you to be talking about eating fruit and vegetables and eating fish, but my patients can't afford that. And I had to disagree with her wholeheartedly, because I don't think the problem is a cost problem at all. I think the problem is entirely an educational problem.
Right.
Mackerel is not an expensive fish in the middle of summer here in Ireland, that's for sure. I mean, you can catch it yourself. You can go on Ballycotton Pier or wherever, So there are plenty of fish that won't cost the earth, but they do provide essential nutrients that we require in our diet. So I think if I was to advocate anything, it would be that people in Ireland eat more fish. But I do think that fresh fruit and vegetables is essential. And of course, fermented food is also essential. And I mean, I remember when I was a kid, the only fermented food that was available in Ireland was yogurt. I mean, we ate yogurt, but I mean, that was the only fermented food. Whereas now there's kombucha, there's kimchi, you go into any supermarket in Cork or Dublin, you see loads of different fermented foods. They have fermented foods have live bacteria in them. and those live bacteria, of course, are important in terms of gut health. But I would argue that not just in terms of gut health, but they're actually very useful in terms of mental health as well.
Yeah. Okay, and that's a good segue into the. So we talked here in the first episode about fermented foods with Paul Cotter, but so a mix and a variety of foods we know is important, right? So not to labour the fish, but I just want to, so for everybody to understand, it's not particular types of fish. Is it fatty fish? You know, they say, we must eat fatty fish.
I think you've put your finger on a very important issue here. Look, all fish is good. I mean, I don't think there's bad fish unless there's a lot of mercury in it or something. But look, fish in general is good. Of course, fish varies in terms of fat content, and even individual fish. You know, if you take mackerel, which I mentioned earlier, mackerel varies in fat content depending on the time of year that it is caught. Right. So it isn't as though all mackerel has a certain amount of EPA and DHA, which are the two essential fats in fish. Salmon, which is, I mean, a lot of salmon in Ireland is farmed, is a very good source of fatty acids. So look, all fish is good, but certainly there are fish which are, you know, the sardines will be good because they need to be oily. So the oilier the fish, probably the better is the that's the answer.
Good, and that's kind of the rule of thumb I was just going for. Okay, so and again, the diversity in food for bacteria and for people that are not scientific, a diversity in bacteria through your entire life is what you're going after.
Diversity is definitely the key to good health. You know, obviously, as babies, there's not much diversity. It's largely lactobacilli and bifidobacteria. And, you know, optimally, a baby shouldn't have a lot of diversity. Of course, if a baby is bottle fed, it will have more diversity than if it is breastfed. But as adults or adolescents, we have a lot of diversity and we want to maintain that diversity. There is overwhelming evidence that a loss of diversity as we age is a forerunner of frailty in the elderly. Yeah. Now, I think that one of the biggest issues, we talk about frailty, and I you know, an issue that I really think is maybe under-researched. Some may disagree with that, but I think it's under-researched, is the whole issue of sarcopenia. You know, we you see elderly people and their muscles have wasted. And they've wasted for a variety of reasons. Undoubtedly, those people are people whose microbiota has also shrunken in terms of diversity. So I think there is a relationship between muscle strength and, you know, we all want to live to an old age. Nobody wants to die young unless, I mean, obviously, one doesn't want to end up demented for 20 years. But putting that aside, we all want to live to a ripe old age. And there is no doubt that maintaining or preventing sarcopenia is probably the essential ingredient. When you look at, of all the risk factors in aging, we all know about high blood pressure is bad for you and diabetes is bad for you and all these things are bad for you. They're not good, obviously. But in fact, there is overwhelming evidence that when you look at all of the risk factors in age, that a loss of strength in muscles is a better predictor of how long you're going to live than whether you have high blood pressure or diabetes.
Right.
Now, I'm not for 1 second suggesting that you should let hypertension, high blood pressure get out of control or anything like that. But in terms of predicting longevity, strength in muscle, be it in the lower limbs or the upper limbs, is essential for longevity.
Right.
You know, and too many elderly people, you know, you just walk down the street and you will see elderly people who are clearly sarcopenic. They've lost, and it is very difficult to treat sarcopenia. It probably can't be treated at all in a severe form, because what happens in sarcopenia is muscles become inflamed, and frankly, you could be eating fillet steaks till they come out or whatever, and you're not going to remedy them.
Okay, there's no reverse. Right. And is it a use it or lose it?
It is partially. I mean, there's no doubt about it that remaining active into old age is probably the key to longevity, really, you know. I mean, so look, whether that's walking or cycling or swimming or running or whatever, but I do think that, you know, exercise is absolutely essential.
Right. So, like, which kind of was my next point in terms of lifestyle. So we have diet, and then what can we do from a lifestyle perspective to elongate, you know, quality of life as opposed to life itself. So exercise is one, but like when you think of somebody's mental health and their brain, you know, like, is there simple things they could do every day that would improve their longevity?
I think exercise in terms of mental health is the single most important thing. There's no doubt in my mind about that. We don't look. People talk about endorphins and all sorts of rubbish, but in fact, we don't know what exercise does. I mean, you know, we do know that there are a vast array of proteins produced by muscle when we do exercise. There are myokines, and some of these myokines do impact on brain function, some of them do not. So it's tempting to suggest that myokines, which are generated when we exercise vigorously, are very important. If we could put all the ingredients of exercise into a pill, it would be the most powerful pill imaginable. It would be far more powerful than anything is currently available. So you know, people. The reality is, on average, people do not exercise a lot. Now, I mean, you know, I like running, and I run most days and have since I was a kid. And it's great to see, it's particularly great to see the number of female running. You know, I mean, you know, was running this morning down the marina, a lot of women running, and you wouldn't see that 20 years ago.
Right.
You know, I think that there has been a big uptake in vigorous exercise in women, but there's an awful lot of people who don't exercise. And, you know, at my clinic, I would always, if people were depressed, I would say, look, make sure that you get some exercise, you know. And they come back 3 weeks later and they say, yeah, I've been walking a kilometre or two every day, and they're 26. Like, I mean, you know, that's a joke. I mean, that's not exercise, that's a joke.
Right.
You know, so I think, you know, vigorous exercise, which needs to be proportionate to one's age, I think is extremely important. You know, whether you like, if you like swimming, grand. I mean, I suppose the problem I would have with swimming is that it's not weight bearing. So it's not good preventing osteoporosis in women because it isn't a weight bearing exercise. It's a good form of exercise. I'm not disputing that, but it isn't weight bearing. You know, cycling, running, swimming, they're all very good, valuable forms of exercise.
So, okay, and like there's so much information out there now, and people as a society, let's assume for the most part, people know more.
Yeah.
So they know that exercise, but maybe which exercise, they know diet, but like you have to figure out yourself. So like everyone has to do their own research because it's not one size fits all.
Yeah.
But there is supplementation. So like we work in the supplement industry sometimes, and I mean, what's your take on, while it's not a replacement for a good diet, is there certain supplements that people should maybe look to start taking as they age?
I think there's no alternative to good food. So I think that good food is undoubtedly, you know, more important than any supplement. And I think that, you know, if one was going to make criticism of the supplements industry, and you know, we obviously as a company, Atlantia, do trials, it's that a lot of trials are underpowered. And in order to gain adequate power to make a solid conclusion, you've got to combine a whole lot of diverse trials, you know, and that is a criticism, and there are all sorts of reasons why that is the case, particularly in America. There are a lot of reasons why that is the case, and probably political reasons now is going to become a bigger problem in the future. But in terms of supplements, I do think that if somebody doesn't eat fish, and unfortunately there are lots of people, as we've already said, who do not eat fish, I do think that taking a supplement of EPA and DHA, which are the two main ingredients of fish oils in fish, is very valuable. It's very valuable because the brain is a fatty organ. We're not able to produce EPA and DHA. I mean, we get it from our food. We don't manufacture EPA and DHA in any quantities ourselves.
Yeah.
And as I say, the brain is a fatty organ. It needs these components for proper structure and function. Of course, there's also the element of one's immune functioning, how you protect yourself against COVID or anything else. Obviously, it requires your immune system to be properly functional.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no doubt that fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids from fish, play a fundamental role in immune function.
Okay.
We were the first group, I think, to show that polyunsaturated fatty acids, particularly EPA, brings about diversity in the microbiota. So the microbes in the intestine become more diverse.
Yeah.
If one is taking in large quantities of EPA. So I'm not suggesting that everyone takes fish oil in the supplement form. I don't believe that is necessary. But I do think that if somebody doesn't eat fish, there is a good reason for taking fish oil. Are there other supplements that one might recommend? I suppose supplements like curcumin, can be beneficial. They bring about increased diversity of microbes within the intestine. It really all depends on the individual and their diet. I mean, I really think that most supplements can be obtained from a good diet, not all. If somebody, for instance, doesn't like fermented food, and there are some people who don't for whatever reasons, then it might be worthwhile taking a fermented food with lactobacillus or a bifidobacteria. That does make sense.
So, like, things I'm sure there's a lot of stuff on the internet, and like as we said in the last issue, you have to be careful of the source. It has to be a credible source of information.
Yes.
Like, like vitamin D. Oh, you're not taking vitamin D? Oh my God.
Yes.
You're still alive. You're not taking vitamin D.
Indeed.
And then like probiotics. You're not taking probiotics?
Indeed.
So like people are confused. There's so much misinformation.
There is, yeah. Well, I blame the Americans for a lot of things, but I blame them for a lot of this. A lot of the vitamin D nonsense that's coming out is nonsense. I mean, show me one big study with vitamin D showing that it does anything of relevance.
Right.
And I will say, yeah, that's important.
Okay.
But in fact, all it is a whole lot of small trials. I mean, when you look at vitamin D, they say, it's cancer preventing. It prevents you getting prostate cancer or whatever. That's nonsense of the highest order. They say that it's good for your immune system. It stops you getting COVID. I mean, what a lot of rubbish. There is no evidence that any of this is true.
Right.
What there is a whole lot of small, poorly controlled Mickey Mouse studies, largely conducted in the US, have been combined to make some glowing statement that will be taken up by the Guardian tomorrow or by the Irish Times.
Yeah.
The Irish Times has a lot to answer for, but I think that's probably one of them, that, they go with this rubbish science a lot of the time, and the things that grab the headlines will be the things that are taken up.
So, like, and again, to distill it down, like if you have a good varied diet that includes fish, some fermented foods, whole foods, not ultra-processed foods, you should be fine. You don't really need to supplement.
Absolutely not. I don't believe you do. I think that, at the end of the day, healthy diet is essential. And, irrespective of one's age, obviously, adolescence, and, the problem with adolescence is, of course, nowadays, teenage kids will drink a lot. With 15 or 16-year-old drinking regularly or binge drinking. That's not good for your microbiota, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's not good for your general health either. And then, of course, as we all know, cocaine is available almost everywhere in Ireland at this stage. And, obviously it has an impact on the brain, but it does have an impact more generally as well.
Right.
So, I'm a big believer in moderation when it comes to, not to cocaine, but in addition to alcohol. And I think that, the key to healthy development and healthy aging subsequently is undoubtedly, good diet.
Yeah. Okay. So recently there's been a lot of talk about the glial system, right? And just for people that don't know, non-scientific people, like, what is the glial system, and like, should we be doing anything in particular to protect it, or is it just functioning in the background, like your heart is beating, your glial system is doing what it does?
Well, I suppose quite a lot has been written in the scientific literature about microglia in recent years. And, microglia are essentially scavengers within the brain. They gobble up inappropriate molecules that might be present. They could be proteins or whatever. They also secrete compounds called cytokines. Cytokines, there are a variety of cytokines, and in response to, let's say, viral infections or infections, which hopefully one is not, but one would assume that under normal circumstances there aren't going to be viruses or bacteria in the brain.
Yeah.
In a situation where there are viruses or bacteria in the brain, the microglia play a very pivotal role. But they probably also play a role in relation to the proteins that accumulate in diseases like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, which are very common in elderly people. I mean, over the age of 85, half the population have evidence of cognitive decline. And the microglia do play a very important role in relation to essentially ridding the brain of toxic proteins.
Right. So there's nothing really you can do. It's there and it's functioning, and like, there's nothing to supplement it, or...
I don't, there are drugs out there that have been claimed to be microglial stabilizers. Whether they're of benefit, I think, remains to be adequately demonstrated.
Okay.
I would suggest that really, beyond normal nutrition, good nutrition, I don't think the average person needs to be considering, microglial stabilization or anything like that.
And that's a good point. Like, so, I mean, everybody out there has family history of something, friends that have something, and so everybody's worried about their own, longevity and health. So, like, what we are saying here is a good diet, exercise, load-bearing exercise, to stave off sarcopenia as long as is possible.
Yeah.
So swimming is good, whatever, but, lifting rocks when you get out of the water, very important.
Yeah.
Lift rocks.
Yes.
And then a balanced diet, a positive mental attitude. Like, what about the things? So I'm trying to get to, we're talking about the body, we're talking about the gut brain, but now what about the brain itself? Like, people you hear about, you should do crosswords all the time, keep your brain elastic.
I'm not sure about that, but I do believe that, positive attitudes, are exceedingly important. And of course, that's very much personality determined, isn't it? And I suppose our personalities are partly genetically determined, and partly they're how we, what we experience as children, right? That determines. And there are people who are incredibly positive, and I, we can work on that. I don't think that anything is immutable. I do believe that when it comes to positivity, that, to a certain extent, we can train our brains to take a positive attitude to certain things. And that, of course, will help us deal more effectively with stress. So, we're talking about diet, and obviously that's exceedingly important. But I do think that to maintain good psychological well-being involves individuals looking at things not through rose-tinted glasses. I mean, I don't think that that's beneficial for anyone. But I do think that taking a positive attitude to negative things, because, we live in a changing environment, and there's constantly stress in our environment and problems that arise. And one is far more likely to deal adequately with those problems if one takes a very positive view of them.
Okay.
So I think the psychological approach is exceedingly important. I mean, psychologists, and in my own clinical practice, I've always used cognitive behavior therapy because I think it's a useful form of psychological intervention.
Right.
for people who deal poorly with stress, or people who suffer from depression on a regular basis. And a lot of cognitive behavior therapy is really, I suppose, rearranging the way one looks at things. I mean, at the end of the day, you can cycle a bicycle badly, or you can learn to cycle it properly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thinking is very similar. You can learn to think in a highly negative and really, in a poorly structured way, which of course predisposes you to depression or to anxiety or to whatever. Whereas, I think that one can teach people to face adversity in a different way.
Okay.
Call it positive, call it whatever you like, but the way in which we approach adversity does determine whether that adversity is likely to be simply stress that is controlled, or stress that leads to depression and anxiety.
Okay, yeah, which is a good point. I mean, okay, so how we look at stuff, and if we can take a positive attitude to it, even when you're under pressure and it's a negative experience, you could still do better by approaching it with a positive attitude. So trying to tie it all together, maybe just to wrap it up, right? We've talked kind of around food, muscles, the gut, the brain, and how they all are interlinked, yeah? In terms of then of, how you perceive the world has an impact on how you live in the world. So I'm going to give it to you to give the folks back home one or two nuggets, right? That's just like, this is the panacea. You just do this and everything's going to be fine.
Right. Well, we spoke about the brain and we spoke about the gut, and really, I suppose listeners will wonder, well, how the hell are microbes in the gut talking to the brain? Because there's a big distance from the flipping, the feces to the brain, isn't there? There are a variety of ways through which gut microbes actually talk to the brain. Many listeners will be familiar with the vagus nerve. I mean, it's a long meandering nerve that connects the gut with the brain. And we know that a lot of signals are sent from the gut to the brain. I mean, we've shown in a study that one particular bug that happens to be a probiotic bacteria can only talk to the brain when that vagus nerve is intact. In other words, if the vagus nerve is cut, this particular bacteria wouldn't be able to talk to the brain.
Okay.
So I think that's exceedingly important. It's also important to remember that, most people will have heard of serotonin because it's been associated with depression, low levels and depression and all that, maybe slightly simplistic way of looking at depression, but nonetheless, serotonin does seem to be involved in depression. And one of the building blocks of serotonin, in fact, the key building block is this tryptophan. And tryptophan comes from the diet, and it comes also from microbes within the gut. I mean, when I was a medical student, in fact, and until very recently, one was thought that all tryptophan came from the diet, and we showed, must be 15 or 20 years ago now, that in fact certain microbes in the gut can produce tryptophan. So if you have a high level of these microbes in the gut, you're going to produce tryptophan. Tryptophan travels to the brain and forms serotonin in the brain. So that's another way. There are other molecules that are formed by gut microbes, and we all hear of fibre and eat plenty of fibre because it's good for you. Well, one of the reasons fibre is good for the brain is that the metabolism or the breakdown of fibre results in the production of molecules called short-chain fatty acids that play a very pivotal role in how the brain actually works. So when we talk about fibre, obviously we talk about, one thinks about, one's gut function and improving gut function because you're taking in a lot of fibre. But it's also exceedingly important fibre in terms of producing molecules that are really essential in terms of brain function.
Okay.
So really, my take-home message would be that the brain is obviously the most important organ in the human body. Gut microbes are incredibly important as well, and that there is a lot of crosstalk. What I really want to emphasize is that there's an enormous amount of crosstalk between the gut microbes and the actual brain.
Okay. And and a lot of people might not know that, but it's yes. I mean, people feel this in, this gut instinct, and that's a real thing, right?
It is, absolutely. And gut feelings or whatever. We've all had butterflies in our stomach. We've, felt anxious or whatever. So anxiety, which is fundamentally, I suppose, a brain problem, does manifest at a gut level. And I think the vagus nerve probably plays an important role there.
Okay. So that's good. I mean, so that people can, I mean, that's very sound advice. It's simple, straightforward, everyday advice, like what to eat, what to include in your diet. I mean, it's not all of what you eat. What you do has a big impact. How you think has a big impact, so you could take those and do your own research, do credible research from the internet or wherever. But yeah, I think that's really good. That's really helpful. So thank you so much, Ted, for your insights and your vast knowledge. We only scrape the surface. I know this, man. I know it runs very deep. The knowledge is infinite. So we may do a part 2 later on. We could talk about something else. But for now, it's just as a kind of a guide. Thanks a million.
Cheers, Barry. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.